The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as James Wilson slowly made his way toward First National Bank. His weathered hands gripped his wooden cane tightly, each step a painful reminder of the shrapnel still buried deep in his left leg, a souvenir from a jungle firefight nearly 50 years ago. At 72, the Vietnam veteran had learned to live with the pain, but some days were worse than others. Today was one of those days. James checked his watch, just past noon. The Friday lunch rush would make the bank busy, but his grandson Tom needed the car back by 3. The boy was a good kid, working double shifts at the factory to support his young family. James had spent the morning under the hood of Tom's old Ford, fixing an oil leak that the boy couldn't afford to have repaired at a shop. The work had left dark stains on James' only pair of jeans and a lingering smell of motor oil on his hands, despite his best efforts to scrub them clean. As he pushed open the heavy glass door of First National Bank, the blast of cold air conditioning hit him like a wall. The bank was packed, just as he'd feared. Young professionals in crisp suits, mothers with restless children, and a line that snaked almost to the entrance. James took his place at the end, shifting his weight to ease the burning in his leg. 20 minutes later, he finally reached the front of the line. The teller behind the counter couldn't have been more than 25. Her name tag read Brittany, and she greeted him with a practiced smile that quickly faltered as he approached. "Good afternoon," James said, sliding his pension check across the counter. "Just need to cash this, please." Brittany's eyes flicked from the check to James's stained clothes, then to his unshaven face. "Can I see some ID, sir?" Her voice carried a slight edge now. James reached for his wallet, the worn leather soft from decades of use. He pulled out his driver's license and handed it over, then watched as Brittany's eyebrows rose. "This expired last month," she said, sliding it back toward him. "I'm sorry, but I can't accept expired identification." James nodded slowly. "I know it's expired. Been meaning to get it renewed, but it's hard for me to get to the DMV these days." He tapped his bad leg gently. "Thing is, I've been banking here for 15 years. Every month, same check, same amount. Your manager Frank knows me. Is he around today?" Brittany's lips thinned into a tight line. "Frank transferred to another branch last month. I'll need to get the new manager." Without waiting for a response, she pressed a button under her counter. The man who appeared moments later wore an expensive suit and a name tag that read Gregory Wilson, branch manager. Despite sharing a last name with James, there was no warmth of recognition in his eyes. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, directing the question at Brittany rather than James. "Expired ID," she replied simply. "He wants to cash a pension check." Gregory turned to James, his gaze sweeping over the old man's appearance. "Sir, we have strict policies about proper identification. I'm sure you understand that in today's world, we need to be careful about fraud." "I'm not a fraud," James said quietly. "I've been coming to this bank since before you were born, son. Just need to cash my check so I can buy groceries and get back to my grandson's place." The manager's nostrils flared slightly at the smell of motor oil. "Perhaps you could come back another day with updated identification. And maybe," he paused, glancing around to make sure other customers weren't listening too closely, "maybe freshen up a bit before your next visit. We try to maintain certain standards for our clientele." The words hit James like a physical blow. He'd faced his share of dismissal over the years, the sideways glances when he wore his veteran's cap, the uncomfortable shifts when he mentioned Vietnam, but being treated like dirt in a place he trusted with his money for years cut deep. "My grandson needs his car back," James said, his voice slightly unsteady. "Just this once." "I'm afraid I can't help you today," Gregory interrupted, gesturing toward the door. "Next in line, please." As the manager took James by the elbow to guide him away from the counter, neither of them noticed the large man sitting in the waiting area, watching the entire scene unfold with growing anger in his eyes. The man was impossible to miss in any other circumstance, standing nearly 7 feet tall with broad shoulders and a famous face recognized around the world. But today, as James Wilson limped out of the bank with his uncashed check and wounded pride, Shaquille O'Neal set aside his investment portfolio and quietly decided that his business with First National could wait. Shaquille O'Neal shifted uncomfortably in the too small chair in the bank's waiting area. He'd been thumbing through investment documents for 20 minutes while waiting for his appointment with the loan officer. The bank had been eager to meet with him about financing his newest restaurant venture, their third rescheduled meeting this month. Today, he'd finally made time despite his packed schedule. But the financial papers in his lap no longer held his attention. Instead, Shaq found himself watching the elderly veteran at the teller window. Even from across the room, he could see the man's struggle to stand straight, the way he leaned heavily on his cane. Something about the old-timer reminded Shaq of his own stepfather, Sergeant Philip Harrison, who had raised him with military discipline and unwavering values. Shaq wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but his seat near the manager's office made it impossible not to overhear the conversation. The dismissive tone, the suggestion that the veteran freshen up, each word made Shaq's jaw tighten. He watched as the old man's shoulders slumped lower with each passing moment. When the manager took the veteran by the elbow to escort him out, Shaq noticed how the old man's hand trembled as he tucked his uncashed check back into his wallet. The veteran's eyes stayed fixed on the floor, avoiding the curious stares of other customers. There was dignity in the way he straightened his back before pushing through the door, despite the humiliation written across his weathered face. Shaq had seen enough. He closed his portfolio and stood up, his 6'10" frame suddenly commanding the space. The loan officer had just emerged from her office, hand extended in greeting. "Mr. O'Neill, we're so pleased you could make it today. I've prepared author." "Something's come up," Shaq interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "We'll need to reschedule." The loan officer's smile faltered. "But sir, we've already rescheduled twice. The financing package we've prepared is extremely competitive and—" I said something's come up. Shaq was already moving toward the exit, his eyes on the veteran who was now sitting at the bus stop across the street. Outside, the afternoon heat hit him like a furnace after the bank's chill. Shaq paused on the sidewalk, watching the old man who sat alone on the bench, staring down at his uncashed check. Without overthinking it, Shaq crossed the street. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty space on the bench. The veteran looked up, surprised. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he showed none of the usual excitement Shaq was accustomed to. Instead, the man simply nodded and scooted over slightly. "Rough day?" Shaq asked after a moment of silence. The veteran gave a dry chuckle. "Had worse. A lot worse." He extended a calloused hand. "James Wilson." "Shaquille O'Neal. Most people call me Shaq." He shook the offered hand gently, noticing the strength that still remained in the old man's grip. "I know who you are, son. My grandson has your poster on his wall." James looked at him curiously. "What's a man like you doing talking to an old-timer at a bus stop?" Shaq gestured toward the bank. "I saw what happened in there. Wasn't right." James waved his hand dismissively. "That's just how things are these days. No one's got time for old vets with expired IDs." "Where'd you serve?" Shaq asked. The question hung in the air for a moment. Most people asked if he'd seen action, or worse, if he killed anyone. Few asked simply where. "Vietnam. 2 tours. First with the 25th Infantry, second with the 101st Airborne. Not that anyone cares much about that war anymore." Shaq nodded slowly. "My stepdad was military. Army drill sergeant. Raised me on stories about respect and service." The bus rumbled toward them, but James made no move to stand. Instead, he turned toward Shaq. "Your stepdad teach you about money too?" Shaq smiled. "Among other things. Why?" "Because I need to cash this check, and I've got a feeling you might know a place that won't turn away an old man with an expired ID." For the next hour, they sat on that bench in the hot sun. James told stories about coming home from Vietnam to a country that didn't want to acknowledge him, about working 40 years at the steel plant before it closed, about raising his son as a single dad after his wife died of cancer, about his grandson Tom working 2 jobs to support his young family. Shaq listened, really listened, in a way few people had bothered to do for James in years. And as the afternoon stretched on, an idea began to form in Shaq's mind, one that would do more than just help cash a single check. One that might teach a lesson about respect that would last far longer than any business meeting or investment deal. "James," Shaq said finally, as they watched another bus pass by, "what are you doing Monday morning?" "Nothing special." "Why?" Shaq smiled. Because I think we should pay that bank another visit. Together. Monday morning arrived with a clarity that only comes after a good night's rain. James Wilson woke earlier than usual, something he hadn't done since his military days. His joints protested as he eased himself out of bed in his small apartment above his grandson's garage. The place wasn't much, but it was clean and warm, and the rent he paid helped Tom with the mortgage. James stood before his closet, considering his options. He didn't own many clothes, but at the back hung something he hadn't worn in years, his old dress uniform. It no longer fit his frame, which had grown thinner with age. Instead, he pulled out the only suit he owned, the one he bought for his son's wedding 15 years ago. It hung loose now, but it was clean and pressed. As he knotted his tie with fingers stiff from arthritis, James wondered if he was being foolish. Shaquille O'Neal was a busy man with a life full of important things. Why would he remember a promise made to an old veteran at a bus stop? Still, James had given his word he'd be ready, and if there was one thing Vietnam had taught him, it was to never break your word. At precisely 9:30, a gleaming black SUV pulled up outside. James peered through the window, surprised to see Shaq himself behind the wheel rather than a driver. Grabbing his cane, James made his way carefully down the stairs and outside. "Morning, soldier," Shaq called through the open window, a wide grin spreading across his face. "Ready for battle." James couldn't help but smile back. As ready as these old bones get. He climbed into the passenger seat, amazed at how the vehicle had been adjusted to accommodate Shaq's enormous frame. "Nice suit," Shaq commented as they pulled away from the curb. James smoothed his lapel self-consciously. "Haven't worn it in years. Mothballs did their job, I guess." "You clean up good," Shaq said, then added with a wink, unlike what that bank manager implied. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the morning traffic parting almost magically for Shaq's distinctive vehicle. James noticed they weren't heading toward the bank. "Taking the scenic route?" he asked. Shaq shook his head. "Making a quick stop first. Got a friend I want you to meet." The SUV pulled up outside a small TV station on the edge of downtown. James raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Local news," Shaq explained. "Lisa Chen is an old friend. Been trying to do a piece on veterans' issues for months." Inside, they were greeted by a petite woman with a quick smile and sharp eyes. She hugged Shaq like an old friend before turning to James with genuine interest. "Mr. Wilson, Shaq told me a little about what happened. Would you be comfortable sharing your story on camera?" James hesitated. He'd never sought attention, had always kept his head down and his troubles to himself. But something in Lisa's earnest expression and Shaq's encouraging nod made him reconsider. "I'm not looking to cause trouble," he said slowly. "Just want to be treated with a little respect, that's all." Lisa nodded. "That's exactly what this piece is about, respect for those who served. Nothing sensational, just the truth." For the next hour, James found himself talking more than he had in years. About coming home from Vietnam to cold shoulders instead of parades. About nightmares that still woke him sweating 50 years later. About raising his son alone after his wife passed. And finally, about Friday at the bank, the shame of being escorted out like he was nothing. Throughout it all, Shaq sat nearby, sometimes nodding, sometimes shaking his head in disbelief. When James finally fell silent, Lisa turned to Shaq. "And you witnessed all this?" Shaq leaned forward, his massive frame making the studio chair seem like dollhouse furniture. "Every word. This man served our country when many wouldn't. He deserves better." "What do you hope will happen by going back to the bank?" Lisa asked. James started to say something polite and noncommittal, but Shaq cut in. "Change," he said simply, "not just for James, but for every veteran who gets overlooked because they're old or don't look like they matter anymore." He turned to James. "That sound about right?" James felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. Pride, maybe, or hope. He nodded slowly. "Yes, that sounds about right." When they finally left the station, a small news van followed behind them. James watched the city pass by through the passenger window, his pension check still folded in his wallet. "You sure about this?" he asked Shaq as they turned onto the street where First National Bank stood. "Might get messy." Shaq's expression was calm but determined. Some messes need making, Mr. Wilson. Some lessons need teaching. As they pulled into the parking lot, James noticed his hands weren't shaking anymore. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. First National Bank was busier than usual for a Monday morning. The line of customers stretched nearly to the door, everyone rushing to handle their business before heading to work. Behind the counter, Brittany was sorting cash while keeping an eye on the growing crowd. The weekend had given her time to forget about the old veteran she turned away, his existence reduced to a fleeting memory of stained clothes and an expired ID. Gregory Wilson, the branch manager, was in his office reviewing the weekly reports when his phone buzzed. The receptionist's voice came through, higher pitched than normal. "Sir, you might want to come out here." "I'm busy, Diane." "What is it?" Well, Shaquille O'Neal is here, and he's asking for you specifically." Gregory nearly dropped his coffee. Shaquille O'Neal? The basketball player. He straightened his tie and smoothed his hair. The bank had been courting the former NBA star's business for months. Perhaps his persistence had finally paid off. "Tell him I'll be right out," he said, quickly checking his reflection in his phone screen. The hushed whispers reached him before he even stepped out of his office. Customers were pointing and taking photos with their phones as Shaq stood in the center of the lobby, towering over everyone. But it wasn't just Shaq who was causing the stir. Next to him stood the elderly veteran from Friday, looking almost unrecognizable in a pressed suit instead of his work clothes. And behind them both, a woman held a professional camera while a man balanced a microphone boom overhead. Gregory's smile froze on his face. Something wasn't right. "Mr. O'Neal," he said, extending his hand. "What a pleasant surprise. I understand you've been speaking with our investment team." Shaq ignored the outstretched hand. "Actually, I'm here with my friend James. You two met on Friday." He placed a gentle hand on the veteran's shoulder. "Remember him?" Gregory's eyes darted between Shaq, the old man, and the camera now pointed directly at him. "Of course, yes. There was a situation with identification requirements." "A situation," Shaq repeated, his voice carrying throughout the now silent bank. "That's one way to put it. Another way would be to say you humiliated a Vietnam veteran who's been banking here for 15 years because his ID was expired and he had some dirt on his clothes." The color drained from Gregory's face. Customers were watching openly now, some nodding in recognition at James. "I was simply following protocol," Gregory said, his voice dropping as he tried to lead them toward his office. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately." "Nothing to discuss in private," Shaq said, standing his ground. "James came here Friday to cash his pension check. A check he earned serving this country while taking shrapnel that still gives him pain 50 years later. And instead of helping him find a solution, you suggested he freshen up before coming back." A murmur ran through the crowd. An older woman in line shook her head in disapproval. The camera kept rolling. "Mr. Wilson," Gregory stammered, turning to James. "I apologize if you felt unwelcome. That certainly wasn't our intention." "Felt unwelcome?" James spoke for the first time, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Son, I've been shot at by enemy soldiers and treated better than I was in this bank on Friday." Lisa Chen, the reporter, stepped forward. "Mr. Wilson, could you show us that pension check again?" James pulled the folded check from his wallet, holding it up for the camera. "And you've been cashing this same government-issued check at this branch for how long?" she asked. 15 years, every month. Same amount, same day." Brittany had inched closer during the exchange, her face growing increasingly uncomfortable. "I remember him from last year," she said suddenly. "Frank used to help him personally. He always told us Mr. Wilson was a regular." Gregory shot her a warning look, but the damage was done. "So there was precedent for making an exception," Lisa noted, her microphone now aimed at Gregory. The manager's forehead beaded with sweat. "Look, we have security protocols that protect all our customers. I'm sure we can resolve this situation today, but that's not good enough," Shaq interrupted. "This isn't just about today or about James. It's about how we treat the people who sacrificed for this country." He turned to face the customers watching the scene unfold. "How many of you are veterans or have family who served?" Nearly half the people in the bank raised their hands. "And how many of you would expect to be treated with respect when you walk through these doors?" Every hand went up. Gregory looked desperately toward the door, as if hoping for rescue. Instead, he saw the bank's regional director walking in, her expression shifting rapidly from confusion to alarm as she took in the scene. "Beverly," Gregory said weakly. "I was just explaining to these gentlemen about our ID policy." Shaq turned toward the newcomer. Perfect timing. "I was about to explain why I'll be taking my business elsewhere unless some serious changes happen around here." He gestured toward James. "Starting with making things right for my friend." Beverly Chen, the regional director, took one look at the cameras and the growing crowd of customers and made a quick decision. "Let's continue this in the conference room," she said, her voice calm but firm. She turned to the customers. "I apologize for the delay. Our staff will make sure everyone is helped promptly." As they moved toward the back of the bank, Beverly whispered something to a senior teller who immediately opened another window and began calling customers forward. The conference room was modest. A long table surrounded by chairs that looked tiny once Shaq sat down. James took a seat next to him, back straight, hands folded on the table. Lisa and her cameraman positioned themselves near the door. "The cameras stay," Shaq said before Beverly could object. "This isn't a private matter anymore." Beverly nodded, then turned to James. "Mr. Wilson, I want to personally apologize for your experience on Friday. That's not how we train our staff to treat any customer, especially not veterans." Gregory stood awkwardly by the wall. "As I was explaining, we have procedures." "Be quiet, Gregory," Beverly said without looking at him. "We'll discuss your procedures later." She turned back to James. "I understand you have a pension check you need to cash." James nodded and placed the check on the table. "Let's take care of that first," she said, reaching for the check. "I'll process this myself with no fees." James didn't move his hand from the paper. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't just about my check anymore." The room fell silent. Even Shaq looked at James with surprise. "For 50 years, I've watched how this country treats its veterans," James continued, his voice growing stronger. "When we came home from Vietnam, people spat on us, called us baby killers. We couldn't get jobs because who wants to hire someone with jumpy nerves who wakes up screaming? So we learned to be invisible, to not make waves." He tapped the check with his weathered finger. "This pension, it doesn't begin to cover what we lost over there. But it's not about the money, it's about recognition, about being seen." James looked directly at Gregory. "When you walked me out on Friday, you didn't see a veteran. You saw an old man with dirty clothes who was bothering you. You thought I didn't belong in your nice, clean bank." Gregory looked at the floor, unable to meet James's gaze. "I've been invisible long enough," James said, "so have a lot of others like me." Beverly leaned forward. "What would you like us to do, Mr. Wilson?" Shaq smiled slightly, proud of his new friend finding his voice. "First," James said, "that young lady at the counter, Brittany? She was just following what she was taught. Don't blame her. But your staff needs better training on helping veterans, elderly folks, people with disabilities. We might move slower, but we're not less important." Beverly nodded, taking notes. "Second, your ID policy needs exceptions for regulars, especially those on fixed incomes who might have trouble getting to the DMV or paying for renewals. My buddy Pete is in a wheelchair. Hasn't updated his ID in 3 years because he can't get transportation to the office." "That's reasonable," Beverly agreed. "And third," James said, looking at Shaq, who gave him an encouraging nod, "I think this bank needs to put its money where its mouth is when it comes to supporting veterans. Not just flags on Memorial Day and Veterans Day discounts." For the next 20 minutes, James outlined ideas: financial literacy workshops for veterans transitioning to civilian life, special banking hours for elderly and disabled customers, and partnerships with local veterans organizations to help with transportation. By the time he finished, Beverly had filled 3 pages with notes, and even Gregory was listening intently, his earlier defensiveness replaced by genuine interest. "This is all doable," Beverly said finally. "More than doable, it's the right thing. Mr. Wilson, would you be willing to consult with us as we implement these changes? We'd value your perspective." James blinked in surprise. After decades of feeling invisible, someone was not only listening but asking for his help. "I think I could do that," he said slowly. Shaq's deep laughter filled the room. and I'll be watching to make sure it happens. In fact, he pulled out his phone and tapped on it for a moment before turning it toward Beverly. That's the community investment fund I was planning to place with your bank. $20 million. It stays here if, and only if, every single one of James's suggestions becomes reality. Gregory's eyes widened at the figure on the screen. And one more thing, Shaq added, his voice serious again. Gregory here needs to volunteer at the VA hospital every week for the next month. Might help him see veterans as people instead of problems. Beverly looked at Gregory, who nodded quickly. Agreed, she said, extending her hand first to James, then to Shaq. We have a deal. As they shook hands, Lisa's cameraman captured it all, the small red light on his camera blinking steadily. What had started as one man's humiliation was becoming something much bigger, a promise of change that would reach far beyond the walls of First National Bank. The local evening news ran the story that night. By morning, it had spread to national networks. Social media exploded with clips of James speaking about veterans' dignity and Shaq standing firm beside him. The hashtag #RespectToVets started trending, with thousands sharing similar stories of mistreatment or neglect. First National Bank's phones didn't stop ringing for days. Some callers were angry, demanding Gregory be fired. Others praised Beverly's quick response and commitment to change. The bank's corporate headquarters issued a formal statement promising a complete review of their customer service policies nationwide. For Gregory, the month that followed was eye-opening. His first day volunteering at the VA hospital, he'd shown up in a suit and tie, feeling out of place and uncomfortable. An older nurse had handed him a mop and pointed him toward a hallway where a patient had gotten sick. "But I'm here to help with paperwork or something," he protested. The nurse had just stared at him. "These men and women served our country. The least you can do is clean their floors," with a smile. By his second week, Gregory had traded his suit for scrubs. He pushed veterans in wheelchairs to their appointments, helped serve meals, and listened to stories that made his own problems seem small. He met men who'd stormed the beaches at Normandy, women who'd served as nurses in Korea, and young veterans still adjusting to life with prosthetic limbs. One afternoon, he was helping an elderly man with trembling hands fill out a form when he recognized him, Pete, the friend James had mentioned who couldn't get to the DMV to renew his ID. "You know," Gregory said as they finished the paperwork, "I might be able to help with that ID issue." 2 days later, Gregory arranged for a mobile DMV unit to visit the VA hospital. 37 veterans renewed their IDs that day, including Pete. When Gregory reported this to Beverly, she nodded approvingly. "Sounds like you're learning." "I am," he admitted. "I never thought much about what happens when you can't just hop in a car and go somewhere, or when your body doesn't work the way it used to." Back at the bank, changes were happening too. Brittany and the other tellers completed a new training program developed with input from James and several other veterans. They learned to recognize military IDs, understand PTSD triggers, and offer accommodations for disabilities that might not be visible. The bank created a special service window with a chair for customers who had trouble standing in line. They extended their hours on days when government checks arrived and partnered with a local veterans organization to provide free transportation to and from the bank for elderly or disabled vets. Lisa Chen covered these developments in a follow-up story, interviewing James in his neatly pressed suit as he demonstrated the new services for her camera. "It's not just about making things easier," James explained. "It's about respect, about seeing us as people who matter." The story caught the attention of banks in other cities. Within weeks, financial institutions across the country began announcing their own veterans initiatives. Some offered special accounts with no minimum balance requirements. Others created financial counseling programs for military families. A few even hired veterans as consultants to review their accessibility policies. Shaq kept his promise too. When the 1-month mark arrived, he personally reviewed all the changes First National had implemented. Satisfied that they had met their commitments, he transferred the promised $20 million to their investment department, with the stipulation that a portion be used for interest-free loans to veteran-owned small businesses. For James, the most surprising change was in how people treated him around town. Strangers stopped to shake his hand at the grocery store. The mechanic refused payment when he brought Tom's car in for an oil change. The local coffee shop put up a small sign offering free coffee to veterans and named a sandwich after him. "I don't know how to handle all this attention," he told Shaq over lunch one day. "Spent most of my life trying not to be noticed." Shaq smiled. "Sometimes the right person just needs to be seen at the right time. You stood up not just for yourself, but for every veteran who's been overlooked." "I had help," James said, nodding at the basketball legend across the table. "Nah," Shaq replied. "You just needed someone to open the door. You walked through it on your own." That evening, as James sat on his small porch watching the sunset, his phone rang. It was Beverly from the bank. "Mr. Wilson," she said, "I have a proposal I'd like to discuss with you. How would you feel about coming on board as our official Veterans Services advisor? With pay, of course." After a lifetime of feeling forgotten, James Wilson was finally being seen for who he truly was, not just a veteran with an expired ID, but a man with wisdom, dignity, and value. And that was a change worth more than any pension check. 6 months passed quickly. The summer heat gave way to fall breezes, and the trees outside First National Bank turned golden and red. Inside, the bank had transformed as much as the season. Today was special. James adjusted his tie in the reflection of the bank's glass doors before walking in. At 72, he'd never imagined having a job again, let alone one where people actually listened to what he had to say. But life had a funny way of surprising you. The lobby buzzed with activity. A large banner hung over the entrance: Veterans Priority Service Program, Grand Opening. News cameras were set up in one corner. Bank employees in crisp uniforms guided customers to refreshment tables. "There he is," Beverly called out when she spotted James. She'd been promoted to executive vice president after the success of their veterans program. "Our man of the hour." James shook his head. "Just doing my job." His new office, a small but comfortable space near the front of the bank, had a nameplate reading James Wilson, Veterans Affairs Advisor. Inside, he'd hung pictures of his old unit, his son, and his grandson's family. There was also a framed news article about that day 6 months ago when he and Shaq had changed things. Speaking of Shaq, where was he? The basketball legend had promised to be here for the ribbon cutting. Gregory appeared at James's elbow. His transformation over the past months had been remarkable. After his required month of volunteering at the VA hospital, he continued going every weekend. He'd even started a basketball program for younger veterans dealing with PTSD. "Everything's ready," Gregory said. "We've got veterans from 3 counties coming. The mayor's here too." James nodded. "Let's hope we can handle the crowd." "Oh, we can," Gregory assured him. "The staff's been through your training program twice." They could help a veteran with no ID and one arm while blindfolded now. James chuckled. It was true. His training program had become standard not just at this branch, but across all First National locations. Employees learned about common veteran health issues, military ID verification, and how to address triggers for those with combat experience. A commotion at the door drew their attention. Shaq had arrived, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came a line of veterans of all ages. Some walked with canes like James. Others used wheelchairs or prosthetic limbs. A few young men and women wore parts of their military uniforms. "Hope you don't mind," Shaq called out to James. "I brought some friends from the VA." James recognized many faces: Pete in his wheelchair, old Bill who'd served in Korea, young Ryan who'd lost his leg in Afghanistan. They were all here. The mayor stepped forward with a giant pair of scissors. "Mr. Wilson, would you do the honors?" James felt a lump in his throat as he moved toward the ribbon stretched across the new Veterans Service Center inside the bank. This dedicated space had everything: accessible counters, private rooms for those with anxiety, staff trained specifically to help with military benefits paperwork. "Speech," someone called from the crowd. James hadn't prepared anything. He looked at the faces watching him: veterans who'd been overlooked for too long, bank employees who'd learned to see them differently, and Shaq standing tall in the back with a proud grin. 6 months ago, James began, his voice steadier than he expected, I walked into this bank needing to cash a check. I walked out feeling like I didn't matter. The room grew quiet. Today, I walk in and see proof that old dogs like me still have something to give. That being seen and heard isn't too much to ask for. He gestured toward the gathered veterans. This isn't just about banking, it's about dignity. About remembering that behind every worn-out ID and every scared body is a person who stepped up when their country called. James looked at Gregory. It's about learning to see people, not problems. Then to Beverly. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's not the easy thing. And finally to Shaq. And sometimes it's about finding an unexpected friend who stands beside you when you need it most. James raised the scissors. This center isn't the end of our work, it's just the beginning. Because once you start seeing people properly, you can't go back to looking past them. He cut the ribbon to thunderous applause. Later, after the speeches and the cake and the handshakes, James found a quiet moment with Shaq outside. Never thought being kicked out of a bank would lead to all this, James said, gesturing to the building behind them where veterans were still streaming in. Shaq put a massive hand on James's shoulder. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes. You know what's funny? James said. That check I came to cash that day, I found it in my drawer last week. Never did cash it. Want to cash it now? Shaq asked. I think they might make an exception for you. James laughed. Nah, I'm framing it. Some things are worth more than money. As they walked back inside, James noticed a young veteran hesitating at the entrance, looking uncertain. James knew that look. He'd worn it himself not so long ago. Come on in, son, he called out. You belong here. We've been waiting for you.